So, you may have a sense of déjà vu because I will be talking along quite a lot of the same lines as Axel has already done a very good exposition of the place of industrial architecture and the ambivalence that exists, which is a good word, between the functionalism, which is linked to the ideas about what modern architecture should look like, whether this has roots in old factories. I'm showing here a cotton mill which was built in 1792 and has now been demolished in Scotland. The part to the left, is there a button? Can I? Yes, there you go. So this is 1792, and this part was added in 1820. But in terms of repeated proportions, numbers of windows, maybe getting slightly smaller towards the top, this sort of is a precursor to modernism, but from the 18th century, and at the same time it has some 18th century details in these projecting bays, like these here, which originally had stairs and also toilets, which were the sanitary requirements of a multi-story building had to be dealt with quite early on. Well, it was recognized by the designers involved, who were not strictly architects. So there's that strand, and there's also the idea that the best architecture should be one that is influenced by the function that the building has to carry out. And you've already seen J.M. Richards mentioned as, in the UK anyway, early in pointing out the importance of early industrial buildings in actually showing modern architects a little bit about what they ought to be able to learn from. And you've seen that as well, this Cannon Street Station. So that's the frontispiece of de Mary's book. And this demonstrates that the photograph that Axel showed, the very same one, was taken by Eric de Mary. And it shows Milford Mill. So it was highlighted in this book as being extremely interesting. The owners of the property might have got wind of the fact that it was thought to be interesting, so they knocked it down straight away. And this Milford is actually now within the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site. So that this building doesn't survive, but the factory site does and is in the World Heritage Site. This building still survives, is also in Derbyshire, but is not in the World Heritage Site. And you'll see that it also has Georgian, as we call it, 18th century architectural Palladian detailing, a nicely proportioned pediment, a clock. It's very important to get the workers in on time. There's another clock there, because people didn't carry watches in those days, in the 18th century anyway. Oh, this is actually 1815, and nice little details like bell cuts, also to summon workers. And this is another photograph from the Richards and de Mary book on the functional tradition, and they're visiting Stanley Mill in Gloucestershire, and they identify this building as being an early example of the ribbon types of windows. So it's not a curtain wall exactly, but in fact it's probably had an appearance more like this, which is in Stroud, and there are bricks missing, the bricks that were never placed here to allow air to pass through. This is what is called a handle house in the southwest of England, and they seem to stand above water, so I think they're to do with fulling. So after cloth has been pounded by hammers, it is then put up to dry and stretched on frames here, and air passes through, and the nap of the cloth to make a blanket. So there are blankets here today, fortunately, that they are made fluffy by using teasels. Some English industrial archaeologists say these spaces are for drying of teasels, which are naturally grown sticky types of plant fibre. I think these are tenter houses, strictly speaking. And here's a little sketch by Carl Friedrich Schinkel of the same thing that he saw on his visit to England in 1826. And while there, this is another version of that, he sketched out Stanley Mill, and this is de Mary's photograph in the Eric Richards 1958 book of Stanley Mill. It still survives in the southwest of England. I think they're trying to work out what to do with it now. And here it is in the German State Archive with a little swastika, I'm afraid, planted on that particular image. But it seems, as Axel says, that while Schinkel was critical of some of the things he saw in England and Scotland, he also came back with ideas. And one of the results of these is some of the royal manufacturers that were built for the Kingdom of Prussia, such as this one in Poland at Mysłakawice, which I've seen twice still working as a flax spinning mill, but it has now been demolished. It was demolished about 4 years ago, sadly. But it has the same kind of, to my eyes, quite over-elaborate cast iron detailing and an open web of cast iron beams, whereas in Britain, the brickwork would have concealed all of this. In Germany and what became Poland, the brickwork stands above that and has multiple small arches. So in a way, it's taken English mill architecture further forward. This was built in 1844. So after Schinkel was dead, but his influence was carrying on. And Axel also mentioned the Ditherington flax mill, which he showed from his visit when it was a maltings. It isn't a maltings anymore. It's been empty for about 20 years while developers were unable to actually do anything much with it. So Historic England has now bitten the bullet, as we say. It has acquired the building and is renovating it in this particular shot. This is what is very often described as evidence that there was a horizontal line shaft, and it has been assumed that the iron columns here are 18th century, 1797. In my view, they are not. They are a second generation series of iron columns that have been slotted in. And what tells me that is the beams join together at this point, a little bit to off-center to the side of these iron columns, and a hole here has been blocked up and was blocked up on 2 levels, 2 lower levels. So I think this is where a vertical shaft rose from floor to floor, powering machinery. And this is an 18th century column, which you find on intermediate floors. So this is what I think is the original iron framework. And this, although it's the iconic view that a lot of people see, this is a different kind of casting. It's more complicated, and I believe it's from the 1820s. So, sorry to disappoint Historic England a little bit about that. I've told them, but they've still published a book disagreeing with me. Then 2 other parts of Ditherington Mill have slightly more ornate cruciform columns with beams which have a curve to their underside, quite a narrow bottom flange, brick arches between them, and here the beams clasp around the spigot that goes through from floor to floor. So I'm getting a little bit technical now, but I believe that if you look at the same capital of the columns here in a building in Aberdeen, so this is in the northeast of Scotland, a long way away from the West Midlands of England. I believe they are by the same foundry, and it was Fenton, Murray and Wood of Leeds, who was just across the road from Marshall's mill. John Marshall owned Ditherington Mill, but they were also advertising themselves as makers of iron-framed fireproof buildings. And so long as the customer was discreet and was a long way away from Yorkshire, then they would provide a complete factory that would be a rival to John Marshall's, but John Marshall wasn't to know about it. So I believe this is what was built in Aberdeen in 1808. This is a recent view. Last week, listed building consent was granted to demolish this building. You can't win them all. As part of an urban village development. So that's the 1808 building, which you'll notice has pilasters, so a little bit of architectural detailing to an inner courtyard. Then in 1825, the south mill was added. 1920s, stair towers were put in where the steam engines were. And 1914, a bigger brick mill went in. So if we ask ourselves, surely you're not going to demolish the oldest iron frame building in Scotland? Well, yes, we are. Apparently, the foundations aren't very good because it was built on a bog. And if you look at the cost of renovating this building, the engineering works involved is £9 million, which is now the same as €9 billion. A couple of years ago, it would have been different. And therefore, but you only get a relatively small building renovated for that, and obviously you get a larger development and you can do more things within the 1914 building, the new mill behind. So what went on? What was the functional reason for these functional detailings? Well, in Germany, because they do things so well, if you go to Ratingen or Cromford-Ratingen in Germany, there is a replica set of spinning frames here. So these are Arkwright type water frames with very low spindles here because these were worked by children. And if you look at this rather unusually well detailed plan of the mill in Aberdeen, then you'll see again there is a vertical shaft running through the first and second floors. There is no horizontal line shaft, and wheels, in this case with cogs and gears, here with belts, power the spinning frame, and the worker, again a child, would operate in this area, and to get to them the overseers would walk around the outside. That's the beam of the steam engine. And this was all designed by Fenton, Murray and Wood of Leeds. And this is the ground floor, which does have the horizontal shaft from the steam engine, and then a series of points where vertical shafts rise up, fixed to the iron frame. These are the tops of the boilers. That's the mechanic shop. This is the counting house, the office, and the smithy. And this is it, the ground floor, when it was still in use. And you see two pairs of columns in the middle, a little point here for the vertical shaft to rise, and then two rows of columns to the outside of that. So let's go to Leeds and look at John Marshall's own mills, which were built shortly after that, although his warehouse was built about the same time. This is the 1806 warehouse, which has these same details in all these ports dotted around the edge of Britain: Aberdeen, Whitby, Whitehaven, as well as the example in Shrewsbury. If you go into Marshall's Sea Mill, built in 1817, you find, again, cruciform columns, but I think something has happened here as well. I think what we've got here are the location points for two rows of columns, and here we have the location for the vertical shafts, which were put in, and I think taken out quite early on and replaced by a horizontal line shaft. There's a bearing pad here cast into the beam for other horizontal shafts. So there was a shift going on from drives that were vertical to drives that were horizontal. And here it's now business space, and there's a nice glazed screen which allows you to see a little bit further in. Over the road is Matthew Murray's foundry, the Round Foundry. They were seen as such a serious rival to Boulton and Watt that Boulton and Watt bought land round about to spy on them, to see what they were doing. But they also made very good steam engines and early locomotives from 1811 onwards. And Round Foundry has turned into quite a good development, an urban village. So these photographs on the left, 2002, on the right, 2007. The Round Foundry itself, which sort of panopticon building, has been demolished, however. So I think we have this strand of iron frame buildings that are textile mills, and those that were built for flax spinning all have cruciform columns. That's my little interpretation of a cruciform column there. And these are the dates of the dates that the surviving buildings were built. I know of a few others that are now demolished. And then we have a slightly different trend amongst the cotton spinning mills. There's one which has cruciform columns, which is Belper Mill, which Axel showed from the outside, and all the others have cylindrical columns. And quite a lot of these are hollow cylindrical columns which carried gas rather dangerously, or central heating hot water, amongst other things, early on. And one of those survives in Glasgow. This is the 1813 Humphreys Mill. You can see the part that had the cornice along here it survives from that era, and then due to damage of one kind or another in the 1930s, a different form of roof was put on it. But the building survives. One of the few buildings that do in the Gorbals. And this is a cotton spinning mill, another one in Scotland at Stanley Mills, mid-mill, dating from about 1823 onwards. Notice that the columns here are cylindrical. The capitals of the columns are actually not part of this casting, which is a tube, hollow tube. Instead, the capital is part of the beam. So there are these joins here where the beams meet. And now it's been converted to housing. So you can live inside part of this fireproof mill. And we did this drawing illustrating cutaway section. There are some mistakes in it, but this is the cast iron beam and a cast iron column which connects through to the one on the floor above. And there are collars here which are wrought iron, heated up by a blacksmith, popped over the top, and then as it cools, they shrink and bind everything together. And this is New Lanark Mills, now a World Heritage Site from 2001 onwards. Also in Scotland. Mill 3 is this one, which was rebuilt fireproof in the 1830s after the preceding mill burnt down. And there are some leftover columns from that, showing that the beams from that, showing the parabolic section with a deeper thickness in the middle than at the ends. This is to try and avoid creating stresses in the building. And here the beams come together by wrapping around the column. So there seems to be a trend whereby engineers were the designers of these buildings. And I know that this particular building, which is a mill in Dundee, built in 1828, Logie Works, was the first of those built by local engineers who were actually blacksmiths who came from another part of Scotland, Midlothian, had training in Glasgow at cotton mills there, and then saw a gap in the market to build iron frame buildings in Dundee. And so this is one of them. And it seems that engineers carried on almost monopolising the opportunity to build textile mills in the city of Dundee, where I come from. This is the only mill that had an architect involved as named designer in the building approval plans that exist in the city. This was built in 1874, so it's a nice French Gothic style bell tower or water tower. When it was built, they said you could put a bell in here, or you could put a water tank in there. So evidently they hadn't decided what was going to go there, but they thought nonetheless they would have a tower of some kind. So this is some sort of non-functional historicist addition by an architect to an otherwise relatively basic textile mill. On the other hand, on the right, we've got what was typically being built, designed and built by engineers. They provided in this case, it was Robertson and Orker of Wallace Foundry, which mainly made power looms and finishing machinery. But they also did the ironwork for the boiler house here, and that was used inside the spinning mill, and the steam engines were in there. And they also, I think, had very capable designer who was capable of coming up with Italianate designs or Scotch baronial designs according to your particular wishes. This was, the spinning mill was built in 1861 at a time when the Italianate style was quite popular in the UK because Queen Victoria had an Italianate palace in the Isle of Wight. But it's going by the detailing of the ironwork inside that I think I can detect a common trend. So this particular Gothic treatment of the iron roofs inside this mill in Fife tells me that it's virtually the same as what was being made in Dundee, slightly to the north of there. And the same engineers and the same foundries were involved. Because we had an argument about this one, where the modern engineers were saying, ooh, cast iron, you can't use that, better take it down, let's do a facade retention at huge cost. We said no, and in this case, because we were funding the project, we were able to have the iron retained. And then we published a guide which you can download for free on ISU, or go into the Historic Environment Scotland website, look for this, and you'll find these beautiful drawings done for us by Tom Swales, which analyse how different kinds of iron, and in this case iron and steel and concrete, 1889, construction is to be found in Scottish buildings, and not to worry about it. That's Tom up a ladder doing the drawings for this particular kind of roof construction, which is a wrought iron truss inside Baltic Works in Arbroath, a linen factory of the early 1850s. And this, to my mind, is something like railway architecture in the way it was being put together. And so you do find this kind of roof as well as the Gothic cast iron roofs. And this is the Polonceau truss, sort of French style. I don't know if the British engineers who were building these were conscious that they were stealing an idea from France, but I think that's the proper name of the truss. And this is the same ironwork upside down, waiting to be reused. I think it was scrapped in the end. By analysing these structures, I think we can be more confident of their ability to perform. However, getting back to our subject of industrial architecture, what on earth is something as elaborate as this doing in the top floor of a spinning mill, where nobody would go, or hardly anybody apart from the workers? So is this to cheer up the workers and make them feel more important? It's quite a light and airy space that is created. I think the reasons is partly in that a typical Dundee mill would have a nave and aisles, so it would be a lot like a church. And if you're going to have a single pitch roof which can span the lot, then you do have something like a cathedral on the upper floor. And for one reason or another, these buildings, which are both now converted to flats, so you can't see these views anymore apart from small bits within each flat, are, I think, a very distinctive characteristic of the mills that I studied in Dundee. This is, that second picture is inside the high mill here of Camperdown Works, which also has some historicist or non-functional detailing, if you like, in this chimney, which was modelled on an Italian campanile. And it went through some vicissitudes and problems when it was acquired by a developer for its scrap value. And then demolitions happened and court cases occurred, and the court judge threw out our case. But nonetheless, miraculously, it has been now saved, or some of the main buildings have been saved, some others have been lost. Ooh. Right. Special effect. And there is one place where you can see these kind of iron roofs with, again, the same sort of Gothic detailing as we saw before. And this is the Textile Mill Museum in Verdant Works, Dundee. Phase 2, or the last phase, had been postponed for quite a long time, and holes developed in the roofs, and the building was looking to be almost beyond saving, until it was saved. So that was it a few years ago, and this is it, with the final phase finally completed. Notice the floors have been taken out. This is a clever move to avoid having to pay insurance by floor space. So if you take the floor out, then you don't have to insure that floor, do you? But it's also created a very impressive space. So suddenly, architects and designers in Dundee who'd never have gone to an industrial museum now have discovered this place, and it's now a UNESCO City of Design, and a branch of the Victoria and Albert Museum opened a couple of weeks ago on the waterfront. So, is this historicist, or as I would argue, functional? I think it's functional, and there's a reason why the Dundee Mills have this nave and aisle arrangement, and that is the spinning frame, which is a fixed device. The windows in this photograph are along on the right here. There's a line shaft with belts going down, diverted down near the end wall. Light comes in so that the spinner gets natural light from her side. It's always a female spinner. And that led to this 3-bay nave and aisle arrangement, which you do not find in woolen and cotton mills which use mules. So this was a replica mule on the right-hand side, a non-self-acting mule, big wheel here, which is activated by hand. The mule evolved from the jenny, and here's a jenny still being worked by the last jenny spinner in Denmark. And this was created for a film set, set in mills. Some of the filming was done in style, and the designer had some discussions with me and other people as how to put together a non-self-acting mule. She'd done her research. And this is one with a big wheel that the spinner, who would usually be a man, would push back after the outward spinning operation had happened. It then has to wind on. The self-acting mule then came in, invented by Roberts, a Welshman, and Platt Brothers of Oldham made them and exported them all over the world. And these are mules of the 1870s, which were still operating in Scotland. And these tend to be arranged so that they face each other. So when the carriage of one mule has been extended out, this one will have retreated, and then this will move back, and that will move forward, so that the spinner, who is a man, stands in the middle and turns from one to the other, and he directs a team of small boys and girls to clean underneath them. And that means you have a 4-bay arrangement, because the best optimal arrangement is to have them facing each other. And so here we have 4 bays with each of these having mules in, and that is that building after a fire. So sadly, we tried to keep it, but it's been lost. But again, with other woolen mills in Scotland, and I think in Yorkshire as well, and in England, parts of England, we have this 4-bay width, which doesn't suit a Gothic cast iron roof. So if we look at House Stanley Mills, an early mill complex in Scotland that has been rescued by my employers, Historic Environment Scotland, there was that Bell Mill, which is the range, mid-mill, which is the range here, which is fireproof with cast iron columns. I think that had carding frames. Bell Mill was the first one, which is this here, on Doors Open Day, or European Heritage Day. This was built in 1787, very early use of cast iron columns, cruciform rather than cylindrical. So we have solid cross-shaped columns here and cylindrical tubes in the 1820s. And then there was an East Mill, which is this one here, built again originally in the 1790s with a single row of columns and timber floors. So my interpretation is that this is sufficient width for 2 and then another 2 spinning mules to operate, moving backwards and forwards here. This probably was carding, and that was the original one built for water frames, which also didn't move like the mule. We've had this Schinkel picture already, but in the 1820s it became necessary to refit some of the older mills by moving columns. So there was a column here and a column here, and in the 1820s William Fairbairn was involved in casting this extra beam which slots in and allows a single column to be in this location, which gives room for mules to operate. Here's another mule which is in America and is in the attic space here. So the mules had to fit in where they could if it was a pre-existing building. American mills also differ in that the weaving might well be carried on in some of the floors of a multi-story mill. fewer of them are done, fewer weaving sheds exist in the United States than in Europe. Architects were involved towards the end of the 19th century in some Scottish mills. So this was Woodhouse and Morley, who were architects really from Bolton in Lancashire, though their address had changed to Bradford in Yorkshire by the time they were commissioned to do most of the architectural projects for Coates, the thread makers, and Clark of Paisley. This building has now been demolished. This is number 1 spinning mill, but that was by the Bolton firm of mill architects. Or you could, if you're doing slightly more medium counts of cotton, you might go to Oldham to get an architect from that city, just outside Manchester, to design this particular mill, which is in Glasgow. So this is in Dalmarnock, and you can have different kinds of roof on the stair tower. But you'll notice that the mule spinning mill, number 1 mill, has a deeper depth than the ring spinning mill, which was number 2 next to it, and it is a narrower building. So the Oldham mills came to be, I think, fantastic looking buildings. This is a Byzantine style by A&H Stott, 1907. Steam engine house here. This wall blank because it had the rope race, so ropes went up to different levels to power the machines, and the intention had been to build a second mill. But as is the case in many of the Lancashire mills, that didn't happen. So I argue that the shape of a textile mill can tell you a lot about changes to society as a whole. I haven't gone into whether men or women operate different machines, but I think that's another factor. But you can tell by looking at the building, even if it has superficial historicist styling, whether you're looking at a mill in one particular aspect of the industry that worked spinning particular kinds of cotton, some finer than others, or whether it was a cotton mill or a woolen mill or a jute mill. They're not going to be at the whim of an architect. It is much more down to the function that is expressed in the building. But I look forward to learning a lot about what you have to say on this topic. So thank you very much.